Snow had fallen in the night, soft and deep, muting the sound of the waking world. It lay in drifts along the fence lines and pooled in the low places between the rolling hills. The sun was a pale disk behind a veil of clouds, its light weak but persistent, casting a pewter sheen across the valley. Elias Boone stood in the doorway of his cabin, a hand braced against the rough-hewn frame, breathing in air so cold it seemed to sharpen his lungs. His land stretched in every direction, frozen pasture, skeletal cottonwoods along the creek, the slow curl of chimney smoke from distant ranches. Yet it was the silence he treasured most, the unbroken stillness that felt like his alone. Inside, the cabin was warm but neglected. Dust clung to the plank floors, cobwebs swayed in the corners, and last week's dishes waited in the basin beside the pump. His boots were lined up by the hearth but scattered with dried mud. His shirts were stacked on a chair instead of folded away. These things had never troubled him before. Life alone meant no one's standards but his own, but lately he'd found himself weary of the disarray. It wasn't just about the dust. It was about how easily a man could let his life slide into a kind of quiet disorder without even noticing. He'd heard Clara Mayfield's name from Mrs. Talbot at the general store, though Mrs. Talbot hadn't been speaking kindly. "She'll work cheap," the woman had said, measuring sugar into a paper sack. "And quick. But she keeps to herself, if you know what I mean." Elias hadn't asked what she meant. He wasn't interested in the tangles of gossip. What mattered was that he needed help and she needed work. When she came that first morning, the snow still fell in lazy spirals, coating her dark shawl in a pale frosting. She was tall, but she carried herself as if the world might notice her less if she made herself smaller. Her hair was pinned hastily beneath her kerchief, strands loose at her temples. She stepped inside without ceremony, eyes sweeping the cabin in a glance that was neither judgmental nor admiring, just practical, as if she were measuring how far her hands would have to go to set things right. Elias pointed out the basin, the shelves, the trunks that needed clearing. She nodded once, then set to work without another word. The sounds she made were soft. The slosh of water in the basin, the rhythmic sweep of a rag across the table, the muted thud of folded shirts being laid in a neat stack. He watched her a while from the hearth, noting the way she moved with a steadiness that felt almost ceremonial. She was not quick in the careless way some are. She was quick in the way of someone who knows every motion costs energy she can't waste. Her hands were raw and reddened from the cold, though she seemed to hide them whenever possible, tucking them into her shawl when she paused. Once, as she reached for a tin on the shelf, he noticed a patch on her sleeve where the stitching had been done by hand, the thread not quite matching. It was a small thing, but it told him she was accustomed to mending more than just clothes. When noon came, she did not stop. He had to speak her name for her to straighten and turn. "There's coffee on the stove," he said. She hesitated before stepping toward it, as if unsure if the offer was genuine. She poured only half a cup and sipped it standing by the window, looking out at the snow. Her eyes seemed to wander far beyond the hills, as though she were tracing a path back to somewhere she'd long since left behind. The hours passed with the slow grace of a clock in no hurry. By the time she finished, the cabin had changed. It was not just cleaner, it felt different, as if the walls themselves had been lifted from some quiet slouch. The air smelled faintly of lye soap and pine. Elias set her payment on the table in a neat stack of coins. She counted them silently, nodded her thanks, and wrapped the coins in a small piece of cloth she pulled from her pocket. The walk back to town was long in the snow, and Elias knew most women would prefer a ride, but Clara refused when he offered. "I'm used to walking," she said simply, tying her shawl tighter. She left without looking back, her figure growing smaller against the white until it disappeared behind the cottonwood. It wasn't long before the talk began to coil through the town. Elias caught bits of it when he went for supplies. Mrs. Talbot was the loudest, but others joined in with lowered voices. "Doesn't sit right," someone muttered near the flour sacks. "A woman alone in a man's cabin every week." Another added, "And no one knows where she lives," Out past the edge of town, I heard. Not a good place for a lady. Elias did not answer them. He had lived long enough to know that answering gossip often just feeds it. Still, their words clung to him like burrs. He thought about the way Clara's eyes had scanned his shelves, not in curiosity but calculation, as if she were deciding what could be spared and what must be kept. He thought about the worn hem of her dress, about the way she drank her coffee slowly, holding the cup in both hands as though savoring not just the warmth but the rarity of it. The next time she came, the weather had shifted. The snow had crusted over in the night, and each step outside crunched sharply in the stillness. She worked faster than before, as though time itself had become her adversary. Elias tried to ask where she lived, but she deflected with a small smile, saying only, "Not far." It was the kind of answer that told him nothing and yet warned him not to press further. That afternoon, as she buttoned her shawl, a gust of wind swept in, rattling the door against its hinges. She held it shut until he crossed the room to latch it. Her eyes met his for a fleeting moment, and something passed there. Not quite gratitude, not quite shame, but a fragile mixture of both. She left soon after, her bundle under one arm, her steps purposeful against the frozen road. Elias stood at the window long after she had gone. The sky was deepening to a slate blue, the last light dissolving behind the ridge. He watched until even the faintest movement on the horizon had vanished. The cabin felt quieter in her absence, not in the way of peace but in the way of something missing. Outside, the cold settled heavier, and the wind began to keen through the trees. He closed the shutters, stoked the fire, and told himself not to think too much on where she might be walking at this hour, or what kind of place waited for her at the end of that road. And yet, as the night deepened and the flames danced low, he could not quite put her from his mind. The image of her shawl dusted with snow, of her hands raw from work, lingered in the corners of his thoughts like embers refusing to die. By the time he banked the fire and prepared for bed, Elias knew one thing with quiet certainty. Whatever kept Clara Mayfield walking so far in the cold, whatever shadow she carried home with her, it was not something the town's gossip could explain. And though he would not admit it even to himself, he had begun to wonder, not just about the work she did here, but about the life she disappeared into when she left his door. The snow had hardened into a brittle crust by the time Elias decided to follow her. It was not suspicion that moved him, nor idle curiosity, but a quiet unrest that had been building in his chest since the day she first stepped across his threshold. He saddled his mare in the pale dawn, the sky the color of tarnished silver, and kept far enough behind that his presence would go unnoticed. Clara walked with her head slightly bowed, her shawl drawn tight, her boots leaving small, deliberate prints in the snow. She did not look back. The road to town was familiar to him, yet he saw it differently that morning, saw it through the rhythm of her steps, the way she skirted deeper drifts, the careful attention to the ground before her. She passed the mercantile without pause, ignoring the glances from early customers, and continued beyond the church whose bell tower loomed like a sentinel against the winter sky. With each yard they covered, the buildings grew more worn, their paint stripped by years of wind, their porches sagging under the weight of time. At the far edge of town, where the plowed road dwindled to a narrow track between scrub and frost-curled grass, she turned. The land here seemed forgotten, the kind where folks only came because they had nowhere else to go. Her pace quickened as she approached a shack leaning slightly toward the east, its roof patched in tin and boards that had once been part of something finer. Smoke drifted weakly from a crooked chimney. Elias stopped in the cover of a skeletal cottonwood, the reins slack in his gloved hand. He could hear them before he saw them, children's voices, bright but thin, their laughter edged with hunger. Clara pushed open the door, and in that instant, warmth spilled out into the cold air like a secret. She untied the bundle from under her arm and laid it on a table worn smooth by years. Inside was not much. Half a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a few small potatoes, but the way the children gathered told him it was a feast. There were 5 of them, ranging from a boy nearly grown to a girl so small she could barely climb onto the bench. Their clothes were threadbare, their cheeks wind-chapped, their hair in need of trimming, yet their eyes lit up when Clara smiled. She cut the bread into precise slices, giving the largest to the smallest hands. She poured water into tin cups, speaking softly as she worked, her voice weaving between words and comfort. She did not eat, only watched as they chewed, occasionally tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a motion so habitual it seemed older than she was. Elias felt the truth settle heavily in him. Every coin he had placed on that cabin table had been carried here, transformed into sustenance, into warmth, into the fragile thread that held this small family together. He thought of the way she always refused a ride, of the quickness in her cleaning, of the quiet way she counted her pay. It all fitted now, piece by piece. He turned before she could see him, guiding his horse back the way they'd come. Snow squeaked under the mare's hooves, the cold biting sharper now that he knew. He did not yet know what to do with this knowledge, but he knew he could not leave it untouched. The next Thursday, she arrived at the cabin as she always did, brushing snow from her shawl before stepping inside. Elias said nothing about what he had seen. She cleaned with her usual quiet diligence, her hands moving swiftly over wood and cloth, her eyes focused on the task. He, meanwhile, moved about the cabin as if searching for something, though his mind was fixed on how to bridge the gap between them without shattering the fragile pride she carried. When she had finished, he set the coins on the table as always, but beside them, he placed a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. She looked at it, then at him, a question flickering in her eyes. "More work next week," he said evenly. "Figured you might need these for the road." She untied the twine slowly, revealing a bag of flour, a small sack of beans, and a modest cone of sugar. Her hands paused over the flour, fingers pressing lightly into the coarse paper, as if to make sure it was real. Something in her face shifted, gratitude warred with wariness, the instinct to accept battling with the fear of what acceptance might mean. "It's too much," she murmured. "It's not," he replied, busying himself with the stove. "Consider it payment in advance." For a moment she stood there, the paper crinkling softly under her grip. Then she nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible bow of her head, and slipped the parcel into her bundle. She left without another word, but her glance at the door lingered just a fraction longer than before. Weeks passed, and the rhythm between them settled into something steadier. She came, she worked, he paid. Sometimes he'd leave small extras, a jar of honey, a pair of knitted mittens, always without comment. Sometimes she'd bring a jar of her own, wild berry preserves or a loaf of bread still faintly warm from her stove. Neither of them called these exchanges what they were. One afternoon, the wind rose fierce, driving snow across the land in great swirling veils. Clara arrived late, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her shawl rimed in frost. She set her bundle by the hearth without speaking and went straight to the basin to warm her hands. Elias watched her quietly, noting the faint tremor in her fingers. "You walked in this?" he asked. "I've walked in worse," she said, and there was no boast in it, only truth. By the time her work was done, the storm had thickened, the wind howling against the cabin walls. He told her she'd best stay until it passed. She hesitated, then sank into the chair by the fire, her hands cupped around the mug he pressed into them. For the first time, the silence between them felt companionable, almost warm. She did not speak of the children, and he did not speak of following her, but something unspoken passed across that small space, a recognition, a quiet trust. Outside, the snow buried the road in white. Inside, the firelight painted the room in shades of gold. When the storm eased, she stood, wrapping her shawl tight. He walked her to the door, the air outside crisp and sharp. "The road will be better by morning," he said. She nodded, then met his eyes for a moment longer than habit required. She left footprints in the snow that the wind began to erase almost immediately. He stood watching until they were gone, feeling the strange certainty that, whatever name the town put to her, he had come to see her differently. She was not just the woman who cleaned his cabin. She was someone fighting quietly and fiercely to keep her small world intact. And he knew, as he closed the door and the latch clicked into place, that he would do what he could, wordlessly, without the need for thanks, to help her keep it. The kind of help that didn't shame, that didn't pry, but stood steady as the ground beneath her feet. Sometimes, he thought, as he banked the fire and the shadows stretched long across the floor, a man's worth isn't measured in the acres he owns or the cattle he brands, but in the quiet way he tends to the lives that cross his path. And sometimes those lives can change his own, without either one of them ever speaking it aloud.